Leaders of China, Russia, and India are putting their friendly relationship on full display.
United against Trump, leaders from some of the world's largest powers right now joining forces to take on the White House.
What happens when the world's largest democracy decides it's had enough? Imagine streets filled with angry voices, flags burning, and an effigy of the American president dragged through the crowd before being set on fire. This wasn't just random outrage. This was India's message to Donald Trump. We are done with you. The fallout between the United States and India didn't happen overnight. It was years in the making, fueled by broken promises, heavy tariffs, bruised egos, and insults that India simply could not ignore. What began as a so-called friendship quickly collapsed into one of the most dramatic diplomatic rifts in modern history. This is the story of how Donald Trump managed to push away one of America's most important allies, leaving India to turn toward Russia and China, and why this shift may have changed the balance of power in the world forever. Chapter 1. When the fire started. For months, signs of tension were building, but few in the US media seemed to notice. Many commentators still painted the Trump-Modi relationship as strong, predicting a major trade deal was just around the corner. On the ground in India, however, the mood was very different. The anger finally spilled into the streets. Protesters stomped on American flags, set them alight, and mocked Trump in effigy. These weren't isolated incidents, but coordinated demonstrations broadcast across India's national television. The image was clear. Modi was seen standing alongside Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, while Trump appeared alone and isolated. To millions of Indians, that picture told the whole story. America was no longer the partner it once claimed to be. Tariffs and the breaking point. The crisis didn't begin with fire and protests. It began with tariffs. In early 2019, Trump suddenly announced a double round of punishing tariffs on Indian goods. The move caught Indian officials off guard. Overnight, tariffs on certain exports climbed as high as 50%. For a country whose trade with the US made up billions of dollars in annual revenue, this wasn't just an economic slight, was a deliberate blow. Trump framed the move as a way to punish India for buying oil from Russia. To Washington insiders, this might have looked like a power play. To India, it was an insult to sovereignty. For decades, India had balanced its relationships with both Russia and the United States. Trump's demand to pick a side ignored that history and backed India into a corner. Prime Minister Modi's response was swift but subtle at first. Trump reportedly called Modi 4 separate times to try and negotiate. Each time, Modi refused to pick up. For a leader who thrived on personal phone diplomacy, this was humiliating. In India, it was celebrated. The message was clear. India would not be bullied. Trump's words, Modi's fury. The tariffs were damaging, but Trump's words made things worse. After a ceasefire between India and Pakistan, Trump claimed credit, telling audiences that his pressure and trade leverage had prevented a nuclear war. For Indians, this was both inaccurate and offensive. The conflict had been de-escalated through direct talks between India and Pakistan. Trump had nothing to do with it. Yet he continued to boast that he alone had stopped a war, even going so far as to say, "You know what the N-word is? Nuclear." This bizarre phrasing didn't just embarrass America, it deeply offended India. Modi and his administration quickly clarified that India never asked for US mediation, nor would it ever accept such interference. Trump's attempt to insert himself into a decades-long regional conflict was not only dishonest, but also disrespectful to India's sovereignty. The Shanghai Signal. As tensions worsened, Modi made a calculated move. He traveled to Shanghai to meet with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. This wasn't just another diplomatic event. It was a signal to Washington. The optics were powerful. India, China, and Russia standing together, discussing trade, security, and cooperation, while Trump was left on the outside. For decades, the United States had invested in building India into a partner to counterbalance China. In a matter of months, Trump had pushed India into China's orbit. During the summit, Modi openly spoke about deepening trust and expanding trade with China. He described positive steps on long-standing border disputes and stressed the need for mutual respect. These were carefully chosen words, meant to highlight how India could find understanding with Beijing, even as Washington was burning bridges. A new world order. The fallout wasn't just about Trump or Modi. It was about the shape of the global order itself. For decades, the United States was seen as the unchallenged leader of the world. But now, multipolar alliances were rising. BRICS nations were tightening ties, offering one another economic alternatives to Western markets. By slamming India with tariffs, Trump accelerated this shift. Indian exports that once depended on the US began finding new buyers elsewhere. Russia and China stepped in with trade offers. What might have been a slow, gradual process of diversification became a rapid realignment. Economists later remarked that Trump's heavy-handed tactics didn't weaken India, they strengthened its resolve. By trying to pressure Modi, the US had instead pushed him toward greater independence, ghosting America. Perhaps the most symbolic moment came when Modi ignored Trump's calls. The US president, who prided himself on deal-making and personal relationships, found himself pleading for attention. Modi's silence said more than any speech could. To many Indians, this was a moment of pride. For years, they had watched as American leaders lectured India or took it for granted. Now, for the first time, their prime minister was standing firm, refusing to bow to pressure from Washington. Meanwhile, in America, analysts were beginning to recognize the damage. Articles in The Guardian and The New York Times confirmed what Indian media had been reporting for months. The so-called US-India bromance was over. Trump's tariffs and insults had left America isolated, while Modi was building new partnerships abroad. The effigy in flames. Back on the streets of India, the protests grew louder. Trump's effigy, burned and beaten by demonstrators, became the defining image of the collapse. For a nation that had once welcomed Trump with large rallies and hopeful talk of trade, the shift was staggering. This wasn't just about trade deals or tariffs anymore. It was about dignity. India felt mocked, used, and humiliated. It decided to strike back with fire. The burning effigies were a message not only to Trump, but also to the world. India would not be treated as a pawn in America's games. Chapter 2. India turns its back. The protests were only the beginning. What happened in the streets was symbolic, but behind closed doors, the real shift was unfolding. India was no longer interested in negotiating with Washington. For Modi, the United States had proven unreliable, arrogant, and blind to India's long-standing priorities. The future, he decided, would be built elsewhere. BRICS rising. For decades, India had balanced its foreign policy between East and West. It welcomed U.S. trade and defense cooperation while maintaining a deep historical relationship with Russia. Under Trump, that balance collapsed. By slapping India with tariffs and demanding loyalty, Washington forced New Delhi to accelerate its partnerships with the BRICS, Bloc Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What might have once seemed like a secondary coalition was now shaping up to be an economic force capable of rivaling Western institutions. Instead of isolating India, Trump's tariffs pushed it closer to nations already frustrated with American dominance. Economists noted the irony. By punishing India for buying Russian oil, Trump had made it more dependent on Russia and China. As one analyst put it, the US tried to cut India off. Instead, it gave BRICS a gift: Pakistan and the crypto connection. While Modi was leaning east, Trump was building his own ties, ironically, with India's longtime rival, Pakistan. Reports began circulating about financial links between Pakistan and ventures tied to Trump's family. A new crypto fund, backed by Pakistani investors, funneled money into a Trump-connected financial platform. On paper, it may have been coincidental, but for Indians, the optics were impossible to ignore. To many, it looked like Trump was sacrificing decades of US-India partnership in exchange for personal financial interests. The story spread quickly across Indian media, fueling the perception that Trump was not just hostile, but corrupt. For a country already angered by tariffs and insults, this was confirmation that America could not be trusted. Modi's defiance. Even as Trump grew desperate, Modi stood firm. He refused to pick up Trump's repeated phone calls before his trip to Shanghai. That silence became an international headline. At the summit, Modi doubled down. He spoke about mutual trust with China, about cooperation with Russia, and about solidarity with nations tired of Western pressure. It was a clear rejection of America's approach. When asked why he didn't engage with Trump, Modi reportedly said, "We answer bullets with shells." The phrase, originally used in reference to Pakistan, resonated with Indians as a broader philosophy. India would not yield to threats, no matter the source. The American miscalculation. Back in Washington, Trump and his advisors struggled to understand what went wrong. Peter Navarro, one of Trump's senior trade counselors, openly complained on television. "I don't understand why Modi is getting into bed with Putin and Xi when he's the leader of the biggest democracy in the world," Navarro said. What he failed to grasp was that democracy alone wasn't enough. India wanted respect. It wanted partnership, not patronizing lectures and economic punishment. By treating India as a subordinate, Trump had driven it to embrace America's rivals. The U.S. had spent decades building trust with India as a counterweight to China. In less than 2 years, that work had unraveled. The price of pride. For Trump, the collapse of U.S.-India relations was more than a diplomatic setback, was a personal humiliation. He had presented himself as a master negotiator, someone who could bend world leaders to his will. Instead, one of the world's most influential leaders simply ignored him. The tariffs, too, backfired. American consumers soon felt the impact as prices rose on goods once imported cheaply from India: textiles, jewelry, leather goods, and auto parts. What Trump framed as a punishment for India quickly became a burden for U.S. businesses and households. In India, the tariffs threatened jobs and slowed growth, but they also galvanized national pride. The protests against Trump weren't just about economics, they were about dignity. People were willing to endure hardship rather than accept humiliation from Washington. The nuclear boast. Perhaps the most damaging moment came when Trump, in his usual bombastic style, bragged about preventing the N-word in South Asia. His bizarre phrasing aside, the claim was dangerous. It suggested that without him, India and Pakistan would have launched nuclear weapons. India's foreign ministry quickly responded, clarifying that the ceasefire had been negotiated directly between the two nations with no American involvement. For Modi, Trump's boast wasn't just false, it was insulting. It painted India as reckless and incapable of managing its own affairs. The message spread quickly in Indian media. America was trying to take credit for India's restraint. The result was outrage, not only in government circles, but also among ordinary citizens, who felt their country's honor was under attack. The turning point. Historians may look back at this period as a turning point. For the first time, India openly rejected U.S. influence and embraced an alternative order. Instead of aligning with Washington, New Delhi leaned into a multipolar world where power was shared among many players. China and Russia welcomed this shift. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, Xi Jinping spoke about friendship and partnership, emphasizing respect and equality. These were exactly the words India wanted to hear. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Where America demanded, Beijing offered. Where Trump mocked, Putin listened. Where Washington punished, BRICS welcomed. The ghost of a partnership. By the end of Trump's presidency, the U.S.-India relationship was at its lowest point in decades. The so-called bromance had dissolved into silence, hostility, and humiliation. Trump, once celebrated at massive rallies in India, was now burned in effigy. For America, the loss was strategic. India wasn't just another partner, it was a rising power, the largest democracy in the world, and a key player in the global economy. Alienating it meant ceding ground to rivals. For India, the break was liberating. By cutting ties with Trump, Modi signaled that India would no longer be dictated to. It would choose its own path, even if that meant standing with nations the West considered adversaries. A world changed. In the end, the protests and the burning effigies were more than symbolic acts. They were the outward expression of a deeper transformation in global politics. The United States, once the unquestioned leader of the world, now found itself isolated. India, once seen as a junior partner, had asserted its independence. And BRICS, once dismissed as a loose coalition, was emerging as a real alternative to Western power. All of it, in one way or another, traced back to Trump's decisions, his tariffs, his boasts, his insults, and his inability to treat India as an equal. What began with fire in the streets ended with a firestorm in global politics. And for the first time in decades, the world's largest democracy had turned its back on the United States.